I'm gonna have to edit out so much of me complaining and swearing about this guy. This video has got some spoilers for a couple literature, movie, and television series, but because it's a discussion of literary analysis, I'm not going to hold your hand through them. When it comes to any medium of storytelling, there are commonly used tropes and conventions that sort of dominate within certain genres. Science fiction will often have some form of cybernetic or bioengineered body modifications to signify the distance from humanity that the person who has them has traveled. Fantasy works will often toy with the ideas like the one true king, the magic sword, elves are cool and goblins are evil, thus setting up the good is pretty and evil is bad and ugly dichotomy. They're all relatively common tropes that we see in these types of literature, but there exists a list of super tropes that can preside over a story no matter what the genre of that story is. These are sort of like active modifiers that can be applied to a story's text to give it a sort of different quality that might separate it from other stories of its genre. Sometimes they're played well, as in the case of like The Never-Ending Story or The Princess Bride, where the story we, as the audience, are experiencing is also being experienced through the lens of another in-universe audience by means of either being told a bedtime story or reading a book in an attic during a storm. These additions make the stories more interesting. They make them endearing, or they have different stakes or something like that. They just make them unique within stories that are their contemporaries. There are some super tropes that are very difficult to use well, on the other hand. A good example of a ruinous super trope is the shapeshifter plot, exemplified recently, sort of recently, in the Netflix show Lock and Key. Spoilers for Lock and Key in 3, 2, 1... Okay, it takes the viewers through a plot that sort of like really hypes up tension and makes the protagonists really look like they're actually going to accomplish a goal even at a great cost for doing so, which is great storytelling. And we the audience are there for it the whole time. There's death, there's trauma, there's catharsis that's on the horizon there. You know, we even already know earlier on that there is a way for the antagonist, or indeed anyone who has this object, to change their physical form. We see it happen on screen, and we sort of know that that's what's going on like mid-season or so, but then that's the problem. Because once the ability for an antagonist, specifically an antagonist, if it's a protagonist that can do it, then this whole thing actually works a whole lot better because you're not working against this anti-tension. But when the antagonist has the ability to unerringly disguise themselves as anyone else, when that ability is introduced, the central tension of the story takes a backseat to the fact that literally anyone could be the antagonist, and most importantly, could have been the entire time, like what we see in Lock and Key. It's so dissatisfying because this artificial tension hiking that sort of like instantly invalidates the rest of the whole story's build-up means that like nobody is safe. Even the protagonist and their crew. Nobody's safe from having been the antagonist the whole time to us, the audience. This shows up a couple times in like The Witcher, where there's a guy who can change the face, but we as the audience know that that's what's happening. It's not played for artificial tension. It's not played as an M. Night Shyamalan style twist. Lock and Key did not use it well. It really tried to be like Bruce Willis was dead at the end of Sixth Sense. Okay, fine, whatever. Your mileage may vary, of course, but I seriously hate the ending of the first season of that show. I really hope that when and if a second season for it comes out, it'll be better. But there's one super trope that I cannot imagine a single person alive still enjoys or finds credible at all. With this scathing indictment in mind, let's talk about today's story, My New Year's Eve Among the Mummies by Grant Alan. Imagine for a moment that you are a well-to-do English gentleman who is interested in no longer being a bachelor and instead becoming attached to a wealthy and well-to-do family by means of marrying into it. Well, you'd have to subject one of that family's daughters to your advances in courting, which is exactly what our dear unnamed protagonist does. Generic English gentleman type 3 subsection barrister, that is to say a lawyer who represents clients in courts, but is not a solicitor and therefore does not directly interact with them very often, does not give his name during the entire story to us. He exchanges pleasantries, flirtation, and a marriage proposal to one Editha Fitzsimkins, the very girl that we were talking about above. Her father had recently been recognized by the College of Heralds to have actually been of a lineage way more important than her surname would have told, and as such, the already wealthy family became part of the sort of ruling class appointed by the British sovereign. And that is money in the bag if you can marry into it. During their engagement, however, our dear protagonist and Editha sort of had their differences in opinions as to the people to whom the protagonist should show his attention. Editha proposed that the attention of a fiancé should be toward the person to whom he is betrothed, where the protagonist thought that it was okay and only fair to share that attention with others who had, as he would likely put it, more of an appealing look about them. Thus it was that on New Year's Eve in 1877, on a trip to Egypt following Editha's mother, who would be the protagonist's new mother-in-law, who stated that she needed to have a climate that was better for her lungs, despite the fact that her lungs were fine. She's just rich and wanted to have a vacation. They went to Egypt. He went to see a performance of belly dancing from the local performing girls, and his fiancée somehow found out, even though he paid his servants to not tell her. So they had a fight about it, and then she told him that he needed to apologize profusely for 3 whole days in order to get himself right with her again. Unsatisfied with his current predicament, he takes a walk off of their boat after trying to sleep in the sweltering heat full of mosquitoes, with the thoughts of the dancing girl to whom he'd taken a fancy at the performance stirring in his body. That's not, vaguely sexual, right? Anyway, it's hot and it's gross and he's got insomnia and there's horrible mosquitoes, so he decides to take a walk to pass the time until he felt sleepy again, and his wanderings led him to the nearby and conveniently never before opened Pyramid of Abu Yila, which, if I did not pronounce it correctly, then I most certainly butchered, which had been studied and prodded and scoured for its secret hidden entrance by explorers and learned Egyptologists for a long time to no avail. It's important that we know that no one has been able to find the entrance to this pyramid yet. But of course, dear Mr. Protagonist somehow deduces the opening mechanism and finds the secret entrance within a few minutes of you walking past conveniently, and slips inside into the darkness. As he goes further inside, he finds that a second secret door seems to have light behind it, like the light from a torch, and he immediately thinks that this is signs of human interaction, despite the pyramid not having been opened for ages, or at least so the secret door that he went through would indicate. His first and perhaps only rational thought in the story is that some sort of band of miscreants have already found their way inside through another secret entrance and are using it as a hideout of some sort for their illegal activities, maybe. But what he finds is far more interesting and far more peculiar than just some grave robbers. Inside this great main chamber, he finds himself face to face with a whole slew of ancient Egyptian artifacts and decorations and like taxidermied animals and just general finery, fresh Egyptian delicacy food. But most importantly, real, live, ancient Egyptians in the flesh, dressed like an ancient Egyptian would be, as one would expect from having gone to see some of the national collections in Britain. The pharaoh himself is there, priests and warriors, maids, ladies-in-waiting, dancing girls, and most importantly to this story, a princess who looked curiously like the dancing girl that he'd watched earlier in the day. Strange that. The whole party's sort of like record scratch stops, and after a tense moment of silence, the princess asks our dear protag what he's doing there, in spoken ancient Egyptian. Now, this is the first of the top worst, most egregious offenses in this man's story. Spoken ancient Egyptian is, according to him, just like English, but pronounced in a rapid and somewhat indefinite whisper, and with all the vowels left out. He even remarks in this story that he'd never known ancient Egyptian before. He's never made head or tails of the writing system, any of the hieroglyphics that he's seen anywhere, but that speaking it was, and I quote, as easy as lovemaking. Tone it down, my dude. Right off the bat, we pick up through subtextual and obvious hints that the protag is horny for the princess. Fantastic. So to make a long story short, protagonist talks with the Egyptians for a while, and after he lies to the pharaoh and says that he's the younger brother of their reigning monarch, he's allowed to party with them. The Egyptians insult his lack of fashion and style and sense because of the tweed suit that he's wearing, and the hat, I guess, as well. And they also make fun of him for even starting to insinuate that the British society is somehow more advanced and less brutish and more cultured than that of the ancient Egyptians. Then, after the banquet is finished, and our dear protagonist has answered all of the questions that the pharaoh could possibly ask him, including giving him, like, a rundown of, like, how the train system works, and, like, what the various trade routes are that he knows about, and, like, a military history for a little while. The party breaks up, and the princess tells him that not only are the people in this room mummies who magically re-imbue themselves with life and flesh once every 1,000 years to have a party like this one, but also that Christianity's current idea of the age of Earth, the so-called young Earth theory that incorrectly states that the world is only about 6,000 years old, is completely wrong, and that the world has been around for 327,000 millennia. That's a long time. And that obviously goes against his Orthodox Christian beliefs, but he is so smitten with the princess that he says in his story that he'd even renounce his religion on the spot and start a different one if she had asked him to do it. So the two of them go off down a hallway and talk in solitude for a little while, and they get on the subject of lovemaking, because of f***ing course they do. This is a euphemism, of course. Being on the topic of lovemaking is probably an indication that they did actually totally bone. I'm pretty certain of that. And the more they talked about this subject, the more the protagonist loses sight of his fiancée Editha in favor of this princess, Hatasu. The princess pulls out a pocket watch, which is another thing that the stout Englishman would not have thought they had, and announces that there's only 3 hours left before they all have to go back into their coffins and sleep again. And this is terrible because they've fallen head over heels in love for each other, obviously. So she entreats him to become a mummy as well. Become a mummy like them so that he too can wake up every 1,000 years and they can bang again. And for half a second he hesitates for a couple reasons, not the first of which being that there's a possibility that these mummies that are in here right now will get dug up and then used as fuel for fires later. But also he thinks about the fact that he has corporeal obligations to Editha, at the very least. But then, well, Hatasu's just so gosh darn pretty that he says, yeah, okay, let's do it. The priest uses chloroform on him, which is yet another thing that he didn't think they would have, to knock him out so that he can be prepared for the embalming and mummification process without actually having to be dead first. And he wakes up in the middle of this procedure to note the priest with a green stone knife in his hand, covered in blood and a huge gaping wound on his own chest, where, assumedly, they're gonna start taking out his organs. So they quickly chloroform him again, and he falls asleep with the princess holding his hand, expecting to wake up in 1,000 years. Except Apparently, it was all a malaria fever dream. When he didn't show up for breakfast, lunch, or dinner the next day, the Fitzsimkinses set out a search party that found him in a dusty chamber in the hitherto unopened pyramid, surrounded by sarcophagi with a gaping chest wound, from where he fell and hit the edge of a sharp rock. Now, Editha, who is pure and innocent and probably the best character in this story, thinks first that he tried to kill himself because he couldn't bear having hurt her so deeply by impugning her honor such as he had done. But when he says no, he was trying to get mummified so that he could eternally bang the hot Egyptian princess that looked suspiciously like the dancing girl that he'd fallen for that evening, and so much better than Editha. Editha, why are you so plain when Hatasu's so smoking hot? She leaves him, understandably, and good for her, and the engagement is of course broken off, and they never see each other again. The theory that his medical friends put forward is that he'd contracted a malaria fever and had stumbled into the pyramid somehow while under the influence of this horrible fever dream and had hallucinated the whole thing. Except he had in his pocket a ring, which he'd drawn from Hatasu's finger before the chloroforming started as a keepsake. So, was it really a dream after all? This is only a slightly less tired version of the "it was all a dream" trope, which is the deadest possible dead horse for 1,000 reasons. But this version, which the subsection which I will term "it was all a dream" or "was it," is the way that children end their stories. We get this all the time in like traditional fairy tales, where they, the child wakes up safely in their bed except for their mouth is full of candy, or there's a feather on their pillow from the wise owl, or some other thing that says that this occurrence wasn't entirely a dream after all. But the worst part is that it is actually probably all still a dream in the first place. The fact that he found the entrance to the pyramid, a feat for which he apparently has received honors, is irrelevant to the rest of the story he tells, because he uses this as one of the pieces of evidence that the whole thing was real. But at the time that he found the outside door of the pyramid, no weird stuff was happening. It was still completely mundane at that point. There was nothing supernatural, nothing even unusual happening on the outside that would have caused him to have found the entrance. That is completely happenstance and is inadmissible as evidence of your story being real. The chest wound being caused by a rock that he fell on is something that he simply just outright dismisses. He doesn't even argue against it. He just says, no, that's ridiculous and I won't even entertain it. Is it maybe because the things that they are saying make more sense than the thing that you are saying? Yeah, it makes a little bit more sense that you fell and hit your chest on a rock and you bled than that you were being operated on by a prehistoric ancient Egyptian magic priest mummy. But you don't have any proof for that. You've got a scar still. Yeah, the scar from where you fell and hit your chest on a rock. No evidence toward the claim being made means that it's not real. And the ring, which is the only thing that might give him credence, well, this asshole could have gotten it any number of ways. Either from the performance that he'd seen earlier in that day, and he'd bought it as a souvenir or something, or from one of the actual mummies that he had found in the tomb while hallucinating, or it could even have been the very ring that he was supposed to give to Editha for their wedding, and he just has malaria and doesn't remember these things properly. It's also noticeable that this is an unreliable narrator story, so the fact that he has a ring in his pocket right now could very well have just been, conveniently, the ring that he was going to use to propose to Editha. But now that the story has to have a ring, it's that ring. That's the ring that he's got. He finally entreats us, the readers, the readers who are reading his account in this journal that he's writing, to go back to that pyramid 1,000 years hence, in the year 2877, to see for ourselves if what he says is true. And if we don't find the Egyptians all, eating and banqueting and partying in that tomb, only then will he take back his story. He's so caught up in the fact that he was horny for an Egyptian dancing girl, and also under fever delusions, that he refuses to entertain the idea that he was actually just kind of an asshole. The only way that he will accept that his story was a hallucination is if in 1,000 years he goes back and it's not actually happening in exactly the same way that he was told that it would. That is moving goalposts to an absolutely unattainable place. What an asshole. There is a lot to unpack in this story. So let's first take on this sort of two-layered idea about the Egyptians having this cool technology and chemistry and that sort of business. Every time in the story, Mr. Protagonist is introduced to some sort of modern thing that the Egyptians also have. Things like matches, or gas lamps, or watches, or chloroform, and all the stuff that's in there that is modern stuff that he didn't think the Egyptians would have. He says that there's no way the ancient Egyptians could have had such advanced stuff. And the Egyptians counter that it's offensive to think that whatever savage, heathen, barbaric culture he comes from is more advanced than their own empire, which is amazing and perfect. Okay, cool, that's all very well and good and forward thinking of the author, except if this whole thing is in fact actually a dream. And if it is a dream, then what we actually have is an Englishman projecting ideas of what things make a society advanced into his hallucination, and he was actually correct in thinking that they wouldn't have them. The idea that the Egyptians are speaking to him and saying your culture is barbaric and you have no fashion sense and you look ugly and the fact that you think that you are better than us is barbaric is in fact exactly what the British would be doing to the Egyptians. Think about the idea of rolling up to a country and being like, we are England, you are savages. You guys all suck because we're the best. We are the greatest empire in the world, and you guys suck. That's literally what's happening to our unnamed protagonist, just like the reverse role, where the Egyptians are telling the British guy that they suck, and that they are like uncultured swine and all of that. And that sort of peeks into the fear that imperialists have that their own empire will one day fall and be seen the same way as the Egyptians are now seen to the British. And it doesn't help that all the things he questions are things which are modern for the time period from which he comes, which he, as an imperialist Englishman, thinks is the best and most advanced. We don't see any stuff from the future, or stuff that, like, he wouldn't understand. It is all modern representations in ancient technology. Chloroform was a popular thing to use for, like, dentists to knock their patients out and pull their teeth at the time. Matches were a thing that existed. Gas lamps were really popular in the Victorian era. All of this stuff is just stuff from his era that his malaria brain projected into the dream so that he could have his weird shame fantasy. No, if it all were a dream, then Egypt was still more savage of a culture than England, and they didn't have science and technology like England did. The imperialist reading of this story is to say that the Englishman in the story dreamed that Egypt, which was full of these mystically attractive and exotic and foreign magical women, was actually just like his own home of England, when it could not have possibly been that way, because England is so much better. The only way that such an ancient, uncivilized culture would be this cool is if it were dreamed by someone belonging to the superior culture. But then also, in the story, the protagonist deliberately leaves out the fact that mummies like the ones he's presumably banging right now are equally as likely to be left in their tomb as they are to be found, dug up, cut up into pieces, and sold as souvenirs or medicines or fuel to power trains? If he tells this mummy that he's presumably doing the hot and heavy with that this is what's happening, he risks losing his chance at that, we'll call it amenable time spent, if you will. That's messed up, right? Like, he even thinks to himself that these very mummies may not even make it to the next time they would wake up because they might get grave robbed instead. But he doesn't tell them any of that. That's American fraternity brother, like, college campus manipulate the freshman girl's garbage right there. Like, yeah, don't tell them any of the bad stuff about you. Just be like, you know, lie about your qualifications, make yourself sound really cool, and then get to bang, and then, hey, you did your thing, and then it doesn't matter anymore. Ugh, that's so uncomfortable, and I hate it. But then also, there's the part where he lies to the pharaoh and tells him that he's the younger brother of the non-existent monarch of his culture. The passage reads thus: "Your Majesty is mistaken," I said, recovering my self-possession gradually, and realizing my position as a free-born Englishman before the court of a foreign despot. Though, I must allow that I felt rather less confident than usual, owing to the fact that we were not represented in the pyramid by British consul. I am an English tourist, a visitor from a modern land, whose civilization far surpasses the rude culture of early Egypt, and I am accustomed to more respectful treatment from all other nationalities, as becomes a citizen of the first naval power in the world. And then later, I felt a visible swelling to the proper dimensions of a royal highness as I sat down by the king's right hand. So this piddly English lawyer pulls the "don't you know who I am" card with the Pharaoh of Egypt, who is a reincarnation of the sun god Ra, and gets away with it. Not only that, but his words tell that he feels entitled to respect purely by being a citizen of a country with a lot of military boats. This alone really sells the imperialist idea that was behind a work like this one. Obviously, an Englishman can just barge into a sacred once every 1,000 years banquet attended by the literal highest authority in the world at that time and have them be totally okay with it because he says he's British. It's almost like that was the strategy for most of Britain's colonization work. Show up in a place, tell everyone that they're British, they're now in charge because they're British, and then make a cup of tea for themselves, and then install a Starbucks or something. In any situation where this was not a dream, he would have been sacrificed to the gods on the spot. But no, he's British, so he gets to break the rules. He gets to be in the imperialist spot, in the high-level spot, no matter where he goes, because the sun never sets on the British Empire, don't you know? No, in reality, this whole story is about a guy who is engaged to a person he doesn't actually find attractive, who he treats more like a commodity, like a badge that sort of signifies membership in a rich people's club. And once he thinks he's got this marriage in the bag, he kind of relaxes, lets his guard down a little bit, fools around a little bit, and then gets caught for it. The moral of the story for him is either that you should treat women like human beings and take their feelings and ideas into account if you plan to marry one, or to just fucking turn down the horny. Also, use mosquito nets and don't catch malaria. This whole story, from the framework that we are given, can be seen as like a guy giving reasons to his other bachelor friends as to why he let slip such a great opportunity to marry into money. And I'm talking money, but him not wanting to say that he just kind of ticked off the bride and she dumped him. No, it has to be his own agency that caused this whole thing to happen. So of course, though, he was treated as an equal to the Pharaoh of Egypt, who was himself resurrected and reconstituted using ancient and powerful magics. He could have even been given those same powers himself if it hadn't been for the fact that the mummification process was complicated and the priest didn't finish in time. It's totally true. I have the scar from the greenstone knife still on my chest, and here is a ring from the princess's finger. Do you remember that Aaron Carter song from like the 90s? That song, How I Beat Shaq? The ending line of the song, which describes how this pasty, small white child played one-on-one basketball with Shaquille O'Neal. I don't do sports. I think sports are stupid, but even I know who that guy is. And somehow won goes like this. But if it was a dream and it wasn't real, how'd I get a jersey with the name O'Neal? Classic. Literally the same story beat that our unnamed protagonist is using in this story in this framework? Or what about the things that happen in Mary Poppins, right? She insists that nothing weird ever happens ever, and that the children are all just having this sort of like group hallucination about these adventures that they go on in the books, but there are all too often remnants and signs of them having actually happened. Or, and this one hits pretty close to home, you ever played The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening? It's literally right there in the title of the game. The whole island and the whole adventure was a dream. But it wasn't Link's dream, so was it real? Was it a thing at all? Well, who knows? And like, I get it, you can kind of play this trope correctly if you are doing a real good job. Like, Mary Poppins does it pretty okay, because we, the audience, get to experience all of it firsthand with the kids who are going on those things. When you're in The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, you are playing through that whole dream, and at the end of it, you see that there is this sort of like demigod, the Windfish, who accidentally dreamed this whole island into existence, and you helped him out by breaking him out of the dream. Okay, I get it, but this whole thing where it's like, oh, but it was just a dream, but I have proof, I promise. It's not it, man. So I'm editing the video right now, which is why I look a little more like trash than in the other thing, but it occurs to me while I was editing that that's actually probably the point of this framework being, oh, it was all a dream, or was it? Because we're not supposed to believe the narrator even a little bit, and it's kind of like a comedy story, him trying to really explain his stuff like that one. So it's not that the story did it poorly, but rather that it did it badly on purpose, so that we, the audience, understand that it was done poorly on purpose because it's a story told by an unreliable narrator who just wants to make himself look cooler. So, I suppose most of the criticism that I had for the story can be washed a little bit away when you think about the fact that it was actually done that way on purpose, because the person who's telling the story within universe of the story is a lying asshole. So, take that with a grain of salt. I'll be honest with you, this story is a little bit out of line with the sort of stories that I've been talking about on this channel for a while, the stuff that I normally focus on, but it does serve as an example of a comedic mummy story in the Victorian era. The lion's share of this story's origins lie in the ideas of like Oriental exoticism and the fetishization of things from the East, as well as the sort of romanticizing of imperialism, and sort of as a result, like, it's neither gothic nor weird fiction at all, because we don't ever get, during the story, a sense of dread or horror or anything. Unnamed protagonist fellow says that he felt one, but that's like 6 degrees removed from us actually feeling it. Nevertheless, I hope that you found it interesting and that it gave you at least a little bit of a chuckle, because the whole story is just like this guy sitting around like a pub table with his friends and being like, yeah, I could have married into that, the Fitzsimkins family, but I had a run-in with some mummies in Egypt, and it didn't turn out right. When in reality, it's just that he was a little bit of a lech, and his future wife dumped him. Anyway, so that's sort of the gist of the story for this week. We're going to be moving on to Jewel of the Seven Stars, which is going to be a multi-part series, because that is a longer story than what we have been working on. It's an actual, like, full-length novel. It is the other Bram Stoker book, basically. So we're gonna go through that for the next couple videos. I've also got a couple other mummy-based pieces of fiction that are not necessarily Victorian, but which are nevertheless, like, horror stories about mummies that I want to talk about as well, including, like, the Goosebumps series as well, because those are fun, and I would love to go back and, like, analyze kid horror lit with the same sort of lens that I've been analyzing, like, classical lit and older stuff like that. There is a channel now in my Discord server, literature, where you can go in and suggest that I talk about stories. Whatever story you feel like would fit well with this channel. If it's a horror story, or if it's like a gothic fiction thing, or if it's weird fiction. I'm gonna get back onto Lovecraft in a little while as soon as I have the time and energy to do so, and I'm not working actively on specifically Victorian mummy fiction. If you guys have ideas, let me know. Tell me what you want to see. If you are here from my classes and you are also a student at the same university as me, hi friends, thanks for watching this whole time. Thank you guys so much for coming and watching. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, the like and subscribe buttons are below the video. There's the bell icon, click that thing as well, because if I don't tell you to do it, statistically you do not do it. I hope that you guys are having a good Christmas season. We're in lockdown, so... But yeah, I will see you guys next time.